September 18th, 1904, the streets of Arnhem. A British major stands in the middle of a mortar bombardment, completely exposed to enemy fire. In one hand, he holds an old, battered umbrella. In the other, nothing but his calm determination. As shells explode around him, he calmly opens the umbrella, walks straight toward a terrified chaplain pinned down by German machine gun fire, and says 5 words that would become legend. "Don't worry, I've got an umbrella." This wasn't a scene from a satirical comedy. This wasn't British humor gone mad. This was Major Allison Digby Tatham Warder. And over the next 4 days, he would use that umbrella to disable an armored vehicle, lead bayonet charges wearing a bowler hat, capture 150 German SS troops, hold a bridge against 2 panzer divisions, escape from enemy captivity, and lead 138 men through German lines to safety. And the truly insane part? This was his first day of combat in the entire war. If you're enjoying this story, please like, comment, and subscribe. This is a tale that deserves to be remembered. Let's go back to where this extraordinary man came from. Allison Digby Tatham Warder was born on May 21, 1917, in Atcham, Shropshire, to a wealthy landowning family with estates across southwest England. He was the 6th of 7 children and the 2nd son of Henry de Grey Tatham Warder. His father had fought in the First World War with the Artists' Rifles, one of the most distinguished British regiments, but the trenches of that war left their mark. Henry was badly gassed during his service, and the effects of that poisoning would slowly kill him. When Digby was just 11 years old, he watched his father die from complications of those wounds. The shadow of the Great War, the war that was supposed to end all wars, had reached into his childhood home and taken his father. It was a loss that would shape everything that came after. Digby grew up in a family that valued service, duty, and an almost reckless kind of courage. His sister Kit would later serve in the Western Desert Campaign as an ambulance driver with the Hadfield Spears Unit, rescuing wounded soldiers under fire. She was awarded the French Croix de Guerre for her bravery. His older brother, Major John de Grey Tatham Warder, would command a tank squadron. The siblings had inherited something from their father, something that went beyond wealth or privilege. They had inherited a belief that when your country called, you answered, no matter the cost. Digby was educated at Wellington College in Berkshire, a school known for producing military officers. He was athletic, skilled at riding horses, the family had extensive stables, and he excelled at outdoor pursuits. But he wasn't particularly academic. What Digby wanted was adventure. In 1935, at age 18, he was accepted into the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, the institution that had trained British officers for over a century. He graduated in January 1937 and was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant. But here's where Digby's story takes an interesting turn. He wasn't initially posted to a combat unit in Britain. Instead, he was assigned to the unattached list for the British Indian Army, with the intention of joining the Indian Army. For a young officer from a wealthy family, service in India meant something very specific. It meant tiger hunting. It meant pig sticking, a dangerous form of boar hunting on horseback with spears. It meant polo and adventure, and a colonial lifestyle that was already beginning to fade, even as Digby arrived. In April 1938, he was attached to the 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, and he shipped out to India. For the next 2 years, Digby lived the life he had dreamed of. He hunted tigers in the jungles. There's an account of one hunting trip where he and his companions climbed trees to escape a tiger, waiting with the monkeys until the animal decided it was safe to come down. When the monkeys descended, so did Digby and his friends, only to find the tiger was still there. He nearly became the hunted instead of the hunter. It was, in his own words, a close shave. He was living a life of adventure, but it was the wrong kind of adventure. Because while Digby was hunting in India, the world was preparing for war. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. And Digby Tatham Warder was on the wrong side of the world, stuck in what would become a training ground, far from any action. His regiment, the 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, remained in India through 1939 and most of 1940. For a man who had joined the military seeking action and adventure, this was torture. While other units were fighting in France, while the Battle of Britain was being fought in the skies over England, while his countrymen were dying at Dunkirk, Digby was drilling troops and hunting animals. It wasn't what he had signed up for. In 1940, the 2nd Ox and Bucks finally returned to England. Digby might have thought his chance had come, but the war continued to pass him by. The battalion was stationed in Britain, training, preparing, but never deployed. And then came news that would change everything. In October 1942, during the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa, Major John Tatham Warder was killed in action. Digby's older brother, the man who had survived France and fought across North Africa, was dead. He had been leading his tank squadron when he was killed. The family had already sacrificed Digby's father to one war. Now, his brother had died in another. And Digby, the soldier, hadn't fired a shot in anger. Something broke in Digby after his brother's death. Or perhaps something crystallized. He had spent years waiting for his chance to prove himself, to serve as his father and brother had served. He wasn't going to wait any longer. There was a new force being formed in the British Army, an elite unit that promised action. The Parachute Regiment, the Airborne Forces. These were the men who jumped out of perfectly good airplanes behind enemy lines. They were lightly armed, cut off from support, and given the most dangerous missions in the war. They fought in North Africa. They fought in Sicily. They were, in the words of the Germans, the Red Devils. Digby volunteered immediately. In 1944, he was accepted into the Parachute Regiment and was given command of A Company of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Parachute Brigade, part of the elite 1st Airborne Division. He was stationed in Grantham, Lincolnshire, for training. He had finally made it into a combat unit. He had finally made it to the war he'd been trying to fight since 1939. There was just one problem. The war still wouldn't let him fight. Throughout the summer of 1904, the 1st Airborne Division waited for deployment. Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings, took place on June 6, 1904. The Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy and began the liberation of France. Digby's old unit, the 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, was part of the initial assault. They captured Pegasus Bridge in one of the most famous actions of D-Day. And Digby Tatham Warder? He was still in England, still training, still waiting. Operation after operation was planned for the 1st Airborne Division. Operation Transfigure, Operation Comet, Operation Linnet. Each one was planned, briefed, and then canceled. The division's morale began to crater. These were elite soldiers, the best Britain had, and they were sitting on the sidelines while the war was being won without them. Some men began to question whether they would ever see combat. Some wondered if the war would be over before they got their chance. Digby must have felt he was cursed, that fate had decided he would spend the entire war preparing for battles he would never fight. And then, in September 1904, finally, the call came. Operation Market Garden. This would be the largest airborne operation in military history. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had convinced Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower to approve an audacious plan. The Allies would use 3 airborne divisions, over 35,000 men, to capture a series of bridges across the Netherlands. American paratroopers would take bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen. British and Polish airborne forces would capture the final prize, the bridge at Arnhem over the Lower Rhine. If successful, this would allow British XTX Corps to race north, cross the Rhine, bypass the heavily fortified Siegfried Line, and drive straight into the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr. The war could be over by Christmas. That was the promise. That was the hope. The plan required speed, precision, and above all, it required the bridges to be captured and held. The 1st Airborne Division would parachute and glide into Arnhem on September 17th. Their job was simple. Hold the bridge for 48 hours until X-Corps arrived to relieve them. 2 days. Hold a bridge for 2 days. How hard could it be? Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, commander of the 2nd Battalion, chose Digby Tatham Warder's A Company to lead the advance to the bridge. Frost knew Digby's reputation. He described him as a thruster if ever there was, a man who wouldn't stop for anything. Frost wanted that kind of aggressive leadership at the front. Digby, for his part, had learned some lessons from the battalion's earlier combat in North Africa. Communications were unreliable, radios failed, units got separated. He needed a backup system, something that would work even when modern technology didn't. So, he trained his men on something ancient. Bugle calls, the same trumpet signals that British light infantry had used during the Napoleonic Wars over a century earlier. Each platoon in A Company was issued 2 bugles. They practiced the calls until every man could recognize them instantly. It seemed absurdly old-fashioned, but Digby trusted old-fashioned methods more than he trusted electronics. He also had another problem: passwords. Military units used passwords, challenge, and response codes to identify friend from foe in the darkness. But Digby had a terrible memory for passwords. He could never remember them. He needed something that would identify him instantly to any British soldier, something so distinctively, absurdly British that there could be no doubt. He needed an umbrella. Digby carried an umbrella, not because he expected rain, though September in Holland certainly promised plenty of that. He carried it because, as he later explained, only a bloody fool of an Englishman would carry an umbrella into battle. Any British soldier would see him and know immediately he was one of them. It was identification and psychological warfare rolled into one absurd package. On the morning of September 17, 1904, Digby Tatham Warder, age 27, stood ready for his first combat action of the entire war. He had been a soldier for 7 years. He had trained for 5 years of this war. Now, finally, he was going to fight. Just before 3 p.m., the transport aircraft carrying the 2nd Battalion crossed into Dutch airspace. Below them, the countryside looked peaceful. Green fields, small towns, canals. From the air, there was little sign of war. The aircraft dropped to 600 feet. The green light came on, and Digby Tatham Warder jumped. The landing was perfect. The drop zone was west of Arnhem, about 7 miles from the bridge. The battalion assembled quickly. There was no immediate opposition. Dutch civilians came out of their homes, cheering, offering food and flowers. The British paratroopers had come to liberate them. It felt, for a moment, almost easy. But there was a problem, a massive problem, that British intelligence had either missed or ignored. Near Arnhem, supposedly resting and refitting after being mauled during the Battle of Normandy, were elements of 2 Waffen-SS Panzer divisions. The 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, and the 10th SS Panzer Division, Frundsberg. These weren't rear echelon support troops. These weren't the old men and boys the British had been told to expect. These were veteran soldiers, hardened combat troops who had fought on the Eastern Front and in Normandy. They had fought at Kursk, at Normandy, in some of the most brutal battles of the war. True, they had been badly damaged. They had lost most of their tanks at Falaise. At full strength, these divisions would have had thousands of armored vehicles. Now they had perhaps a handful of operational tanks between them, but they still had 7,000 experienced SS soldiers, anti-tank guns, mortars, machine guns, and the will to fight. And when the British paratroopers began landing, these German forces were alerted immediately. The plan called for 3 routes into Arnhem. The 1st Battalion would take the northern route, Leopard. The 3rd Battalion would take the central route, Tiger. And the 2nd Battalion, Digby's battalion, would take the southern route along the river, Lion route. They had to move fast. Speed was everything. If they could reach the bridge before the Germans could organize a defense, they might actually pull this off. A company, led by Digby, was in the vanguard. They had about 8 miles to cover, and they needed to do it before dark. Almost immediately, things started going wrong. The 1st Parachute Brigade's reconnaissance squadron, mounted in jeeps, was supposed to race ahead and secure the bridge in a coup de main, a lightning strike. But they ran into a German blocking force almost immediately and were stopped cold. The jeeps, lightly armored and vulnerable, couldn't break through. So it was up to the infantry. It was up to Digby. A company began its march. They moved through woods, through residential areas. The radio started failing almost immediately, exactly as Digby had predicted. But the bugles worked. The clear notes cut through the confusion, keeping the platoons coordinated, and then they hit resistance. German troops, likely from SS units, had set up positions along the route. There were armored cars blocking the streets. Digby called for an anti-tank gun to be brought forward, but he didn't wait. He was a thruster, remember? Waiting wasn't in his vocabulary. Instead, he led his men through the back gardens of houses, avoiding the streets entirely. They went over fences, through vegetable plots, past startled Dutch families hiding in their homes. The Germans were watching the roads. Digby ignored the roads. It was slow, it was unconventional, but it worked. A company kept moving, and they were killing Germans as they went. SS troops trying to establish blocking positions found themselves outflanked and surrounded. Digby's men were fast, aggressive, and motivated. They wanted this bridge. By the time A Company had covered those 8 miles, They had killed or captured over 150 German soldiers, including numerous SS troops. They had done it in about 7 hours, and they had lost only 1 man killed and a handful wounded. It was a brilliant piece of small unit tactics, led by a man who had been told he was too aggressive, too much of a thruster. But being aggressive and being a thruster was exactly what the mission needed. As darkness fell on September 17th, a company reached Arnhem Bridge. The massive structure loomed ahead, its steel girders stark against the evening sky. This was the objective. This was what they had come for. Lieutenant Jack Grayburn's platoon was the first to reach it. There was no opposition on the northern end. They quickly secured positions around the bridge approach, setting up in buildings overlooking the roadway. The railway bridge further east had been blown by the Germans before they could take it, eliminating one potential crossing. And attempts to rush across the main bridge to capture the southern end were met with withering fire from German positions on the far side. They had the northern end, but that was all they had. By nightfall, about 750 men had reached the bridge. That was far less than planned. The entire 1st Airborne Division, nearly 10,000 men, was supposed to be here. Instead, fewer than 750 had made it through. The 1st and 3rd Battalions had been stopped by German blocking forces. They were fighting desperately just to stay alive, let alone reach the bridge. Only the 2nd Battalion, led by Digby and his aggressive tactics, had made it all the way. Lieutenant Colonel Frost established his headquarters in buildings overlooking the northern ramp. Brigade headquarters personnel, engineers, some anti-tank gunners, a few others who had followed the 2nd Battalion's route, they all took up defensive positions, and they settled in to wait for the relief that was supposed to arrive in 48 hours. Digby found an old umbrella in one of the abandoned houses near the bridge. He picked it up, tested it, and decided it would do nicely. Now he had his identification marker. Now any man in the perimeter could look up and see him, the man with the umbrella, walking around like he was on a Sunday stroll. The first night was relatively quiet. The Germans were regrouping, trying to figure out what they were facing. But at dawn on September 18th, everything changed. The 9th S Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, commanded by SS Captain Victor Grabner, had been ordered south toward Nijmegen the previous evening. These were fast-moving armored reconnaissance vehicles, half-tracks and armored cars, designed to probe enemy positions and strike quickly. Grabner had crossed the bridge the evening before and learned that there were British forces at the northern end. So, on the morning of September 18th, he decided to retake the bridge with a lightning strike from the south. It was a bold move. It was also a fatal mistake. Around 9 a.m., Grabner's column, more than 22 armored vehicles, roared onto the bridge from the south, engines screaming, guns firing. They came at full speed, thinking they could overwhelm the British paratroopers through shock and violence. They had no idea what they were driving into. The British were dug in. They had anti-tank guns. They had Piats, infantry anti-tank weapons. And they had soldiers who had spent years training for exactly this moment. The Germans drove straight into a kill zone. The British held their fire until the column was fully committed to the bridge. And then they opened up. Anti-tank rounds smashed into armored cars. Machine guns raked the exposed crews. The lead vehicles exploded. The vehicles behind them tried to turn around, but the bridge was too narrow. They crashed into each other, into burning wrecks, into the steel railings. It was a slaughter. 12 of the 22 armored vehicles were destroyed. Over 70 German soldiers were killed. SS Captain Grabner himself was killed in the attack. The British had held. The bridge approach was littered with burning German armor. Black smoke poured into the morning sky, and the men of the 2nd Battalion knew they had won the first round. But the celebration was short-lived, because now the Germans knew exactly where the British were, and now they were going to bring everything they had. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, despite their losses in Normandy, still had thousands of infantry, artillery, mortars, and some tanks. They began to encircle the British positions, and they began to systematically destroy the buildings where the paratroopers were hiding. This is where Digby Tatham Mortar's legend really began. As German mortars and artillery pounded the British positions, as snipers picked off anyone who moved, as the perimeter shrank under constant pressure, Digby could be seen walking calmly through the defensive positions, umbrella in hand, inspecting his men, offering encouragement, seemingly oblivious to the incoming fire. He wore his red beret instead of a steel helmet. He had found an old bowler hat somewhere, and sometimes he wore that instead. When German tanks approached the bridge, threatening to overrun their positions, Digby led a bayonet charge against them. A bayonet charge against tanks. He wore the bowler hat during this charge, waving his umbrella over his head like a sword as he led his men forward. The sheer audacity of it shocked the Germans. The attack was beaten back, but Digby had made his point. They were not giving up this bridge. At one point, German infantry were advancing on their positions, and Digby stood up, in full view of the enemy, and poked his umbrella through the observation slit of a German armored car, trying to blind or injure the driver. He actually disabled the vehicle. There are accounts from multiple witnesses. He shoved an umbrella through the slit and poked the driver in the eye, incapacitating him. The armored car veered off course, and the attack stalled. This was not standard military doctrine. This was not something taught at Sandhurst. This was Digby Tatham Warder improvising with the tools at hand. But perhaps the most famous incident happened on September 18th or 19th. The battalion's chaplain, Father Bernard Egan, needed to cross a street to reach wounded soldiers sheltering in a cellar, but the street was being swept by German machine gun fire and mortars. Every time Father Egan tried to move, fire forced him back into cover. He was pinned down, unable to reach men who desperately needed spiritual comfort and medical attention. And then he saw a figure approaching through the smoke and dust. It was Digby, walking calmly, umbrella in hand. Digby opened the umbrella, held it over Father Egan's head, and said, "Come along, Padre. Don't worry about the bullets. I've got an umbrella." Father Egan, stunned by the absurdity of the situation, pointed out that mortars were exploding all around them. Digby glanced at the explosions and replied, "Oh my goodness, Pat, but what if it rains?" And then he escorted the chaplain across the street, under the umbrella, through machine gun fire and mortar bombardments, as casually as if they were strolling through a park in London. They made it across. Both survived. Father Egan was able to reach the wounded, and Digby went back to directing the defense. This story is corroborated by multiple witnesses. It actually happened. A British officer walked a chaplain through enemy fire under an umbrella because he was worried it might rain. Later, another officer, Lieutenant Pat Barnett, questioned Digby about the umbrella's usefulness in combat. Digby looked at him with complete seriousness and said, "What if it rains?" This wasn't madness. This was something else. This was a man who had found a way to inspire his troops through sheer, absurd courage. Every soldier in that perimeter could look up and see Digby with his umbrella, calm and unconcerned, and think, if he's not worried, why should I be? It was leadership through example, leadership through audacity, leadership through being so British that the Germans probably couldn't believe what they were seeing. But by September 19th, the situation was becoming desperate. The rest of the 1st Airborne Division was still fighting to reach them, but the Germans had sealed off all approach routes. No reinforcements were coming. XXX Corps, the ground forces that were supposed to relieve them, had been delayed by German resistance and terrain. They were still miles away. The men at the bridge were alone. They were running low on ammunition. They were running low on food. Medical supplies were almost gone. The wounded were being treated in cellars with whatever the medics could scavenge. And the German attacks were intensifying. The SS brought up more tanks, more artillery. They set buildings on fire to drive out the defenders. The British perimeter shrank from several blocks to just a few buildings immediately adjacent to the bridge. Digby continued to move through the positions, directing fire, encouraging men, using those bugle calls to coordinate movements when the radios finally died completely. On September 20th, the situation became critical. German tanks were now firing point-blank into the British positions. Buildings were collapsing. The bridge itself was under constant fire. Lieutenant Jack Grayburn, the young officer who had been first to reach the bridge, had been wounded early in the battle but continued fighting. On the night of September 20th, a German tank advanced on his position. Grayburn stood up in full view of the tank, exposing himself to its machine guns, and personally directed his men's withdrawal to new positions. He was cut down by German fire and killed instantly. He was 26 years old. He would later be posthumously promoted to captain and awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration for valor. Digby wrote the recommendation himself after the battle, describing Jack's extraordinary courage in detail. By the evening of September 20th, organized resistance at the bridge was collapsing. Fire was everywhere. The wounded filled the cellars. Ammunition was gone. The men had held for almost 4 full days, twice as long as planned, but they could hold no longer. The final radio message sent from the bridge was simple: out of ammunition, God save the king. Major Freddie Goff, the reconnaissance squadron commander, took command when Frost was badly wounded by mortar fire. He gave the order to scatter, to break up into small groups and try to escape back to the main British perimeter in Oosterbeek. But for most of the men, there was no escape. The Germans had them surrounded. Digby had been wounded himself. Shrapnel had caught him, slicing open his trousers and wounding his legs and back. He was in pain, exhausted, and out of ammunition. On September 21st, the Germans overran the last British positions. Digby and most of the surviving defenders were captured. The battle for Arnhem Bridge was over. The Germans had won, but they had paid a terrible price. The 2nd Battalion had held that bridge for 4 days against vastly superior forces. They had killed hundreds of German soldiers. They had destroyed dozens of vehicles, and they had given the rest of the 1st Airborne Division time to establish a defensive perimeter in Oosterbeek, a perimeter that would hold for another 5 days, tying down German forces that could have been used elsewhere. The battle was lost, but the defense had been magnificent. Of the approximately 750 men who had reached the bridge, about 210 were wounded, many of whom had continued fighting despite their injuries. Approximately 100 were killed or would die of wounds. The rest were captured. Digby was taken to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Arnhem, along with other wounded British prisoners. The German medical staff treated them with professional courtesy. The fighting was over. Now they were prisoners of war. Digby was in pain from his wounds. He was exhausted. He hadn't slept properly in 4 days. But surrender, captivity, sitting out the rest of the war, that wasn't acceptable. Not after he had finally gotten his chance to fight. Not after everything that had happened. So, that night, September 21st, Digby and his second-in-command, Captain Tony Frank, made their escape. They waited until the German nurses were out of sight. They dressed in whatever clothes they could find, and then they climbed out of a first-floor window. They crawled through the hospital gardens, past German guards, and into a nearby wood. Both men were wounded. Both were exhausted. They had no maps, only the small button compasses that were part of their escape kits. But they were free. They moved west through the night, using their compasses for direction, until they reached a farm at dawn. The Dutch farmers who found them were taking an enormous risk. If the Germans discovered they were hiding British soldiers, the penalty was death. But the Dutch resistance was active in the area, and they had been sheltering escaped British paratroopers since the battle began. Digby and Tony Frank were taken in, given civilian clothes, and hidden. Over the next few days, Digby made contact with more members of the resistance. He learned that there were other British paratroopers in hiding throughout the area. Men who had been cut off during the fighting, men who had escaped from German captivity, men who had missed the evacuation when the rest of the division withdrew across the Rhine on September 25th. There were at least 100, possibly more, scattered throughout the countryside around Yde and Arnhem. And Digby, in classic Digby fashion, decided he wasn't going to sit around waiting to be rescued. He was going to organize these men and lead them back to Allied lines. This is where Digby's story becomes truly remarkable, because he didn't just hide out and wait for the war to move on. He created essentially a hidden military unit behind enemy lines. Brigadier Gerald Lathbury, commander of the 1st Parachute Brigade, had also escaped and was in hiding. Lieutenant Colonel David Doby, commander of the 1st Battalion, had escaped as well. The 3 men established what they jokingly called a headquarters in hiding. Digby became responsible for organizing the scattered evaders, about 100 men in the Yde area alone. The Dutch resistance provided safe houses, food, and intelligence about German movements, and the risks they took were extraordinary. Every Dutch civilian who hit a British soldier was risking execution not just for themselves, but for their entire family. The Germans were ruthless about this. Digby moved between safe houses, visiting the hidden soldiers, keeping their spirits up, organizing them into squads. He dressed in civilian clothes, pretending to be a deaf and mute Dutchman when he was near Germans. This apparently worked, though one has to wonder how convincing a 6-foot-tall British officer could be as a mute Dutchman, but the disguise held. He wasn't recaptured. Through the resistance, Digby made contact with Lieutenant Gilbert Kirshen of the Belgian SAS, who was operating in the area. Kirshen arranged supply drops. Parachutes would fall in the night carrying weapons, uniforms, ammunition. The plan initially was to use this hidden force to harass the Germans, to conduct guerrilla operations. But as September turned into October, it became clear that the Allied advance had stalled. XXX Corps wasn't going to push north across the Rhine anytime soon. The Germans weren't withdrawing. These men couldn't stay in hiding indefinitely. The Dutch families sheltering them couldn't sustain this risk forever. They needed to get out. Lieutenant Colonel Doby volunteered to make contact with the Allied lines. On the night of October 17th, he and a resistance guide rowed across the Rhine in a steel boat. It was terrifying. The Rhine was wide, the current was strong, and German sentries patrolled both banks, but they made it across. Doby was taken by jeep to Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, commander of XXX Corps. He explained the situation. He had 100 men ready to escape, more if the operation could be expanded. Could XXX Corps help? Horrocks agreed immediately. The operation was codenamed Pegasus, after the winged horse of Greek mythology, the symbol of British airborne forces. It would be a night crossing of the Rhine, with boats provided by the Allies and guides provided by the Dutch resistance. Speed and secrecy were essential. The plan was set for October 22nd, but on October 20th, the Germans issued an order. All civilians in the villages near Arnhem had to evacuate within 2 days. It was a disaster. Thousands of Dutch civilians would be on the roads. The Germans would be everywhere. The chance of keeping the escape secret was almost zero. Digby and the resistance leaders made a quick decision. They would launch Pegasus immediately on the night of October 2nd, using the chaos of the civilian evacuation as cover. The plan was audacious. The men would gather in small groups throughout the day of October 22nd, moving from their hiding places to a rendezvous point in woods near Renkum, just north of the Rhine. They would travel by bicycle in groups of 5, guided by young resistance members who knew every back road and path. Some would travel in 2 small trucks with wood gas generators, vehicles that could barely make it up hills, but wouldn't require gasoline that was almost impossible to get. By nightfall on October 22nd, 139 men had gathered in the woods. Most were British paratroopers from the 1st Airborne Division. There was 1 American from the 82nd Airborne, some downed RAF aircrew, a few escaped Russian prisoners who wanted to join the Allies, and some Dutch civilians who needed to escape German persecution. And there were German machine gun positions 500 yards away. The assembly point was that close to the enemy. 1 alert German patrol and the entire operation would be over. At 9 p.m., the men moved out. They moved in absolute silence, in single file, through the darkness. The resistance guides led them along paths they had memorized. They avoided roads, avoided German checkpoints, and moved like ghosts through the night. It took hours to cover the few miles to the riverbank, and there, on the north side of the Rhine, they waited. On the south side, American engineers from the 101st Airborne Division and Canadian engineers had brought boats. Storm boats, canvas assault boats, anything that could float. British Hex Corps artillery was ready to provide suppressing fire if needed, but they were hoping to do this quietly. At midnight, the signal was given. The boats pushed out from the south bank and crossed the dark water to the north side. The men waded into the cold Rhine, climbed into the boats, and began the crossing. Digby was one of the last to cross. Before he got into his boat, he had a spotlight with him. He stood on the northern bank of the Rhine, in full view of any German observers, and flashed a message in Morse code across the water to the Allied forces on the far bank. V for victory, 3 short, 1 long, the signal that had sustained British resistance throughout the war. And then he got into a boat and crossed the Rhine to safety. Of the 139 men who gathered in the woods, 138 made it across. 1 man, a Russian prisoner, was captured by the Germans during the crossing. Everyone else made it. It was October 23, 1944, just over a month after the battle had ended. Operation Pegasus was a complete success. Digby had led 138 men through German lines and across the Rhine to freedom. For his actions at Arnhem Bridge and during Operation Pegasus, Digby was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. The citation praised his courage, leadership, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. It specifically mentioned his role in organizing the escaped paratroopers and leading them to safety. He was also promoted to acting lieutenant colonel, and given temporary command of the 2nd Battalion when they returned to England, though he later reverted to major and served as second in command. But perhaps more importantly, Digby wrote a detailed report on the fighting at Arnhem Bridge. In that report, he described the actions of Lieutenant Jack Grayburn in extraordinary detail. He recommended Grayburn for both a posthumous Victoria Cross and promotion to captain. Both recommendations were approved. Jack Grayburn's Victoria Cross citation was taken almost verbatim from Digby's report. Digby made sure that his men, particularly those who had died, received the recognition they deserved. After the war ended, Digby served briefly in British-controlled Palestine, where tensions between Arabs and Jews were already leading toward the conflict that would erupt in 1948. But he didn't stay long. In 1946, he was appointed to the 5th King's African Rifles in British Kenya, and he decided that Africa was where he wanted to be. He bought 2 estates in Kenya, one in Iburu and one in Nanyuki. He was going to be a farmer. He was going to run cattle, grow crops, and live the life of a colonial settler in the highlands of Kenya. In 1949, he married Jane Boyd, whose father was also a farmer in Nanyuki. They would have 3 daughters together and settle into what should have been a peaceful life. But Africa in the 1950s wasn't peaceful. In 1952, the Mau Mau uprising began in Kenya. The Mau Mau were a militant nationalist movement fighting against British colonial rule and white settlers. The conflict was brutal. Farms were attacked. Settlers were killed. The colonial government declared a state of emergency. And Digby Tatham Warder, who had spent 5 years of World War II trying to find a war to fight, found himself in the middle of another one. He raised a volunteer mounted police force at his own expense. Volunteers from the settler community, men who could ride horses and handle weapons, they became the Mau Mounties. And Digby led them into action against the Mau Mau rebels. It wasn't conventional warfare. It was counterinsurgency, tracking through the highlands, trying to protect isolated farms, trying to catch rebel bands before they could strike. Digby had experience with horses from his youth. He had experience with unconventional tactics from Arnhem, and he was still the same man who had led bayonet charges with an umbrella. The Mau Mounties became known for their effectiveness, but also for their willingness to operate under Digby's unconventional leadership. The Mau Mau uprising lasted until 1960. When it ended, Kenya moved toward independence. In 1963, Kenya became an independent nation. The British colonial period was over. There are reports that when the transition was happening, British Defense Staff told the British High Commissioner to look after Tatham Warder. Even at the highest levels of government, people knew who Digby was. They knew what he had done. They wanted to make sure he was protected during the transition. But Digby didn't need protection. He adapted. He had always been good at adapting. He stayed in Kenya and ran his estates. But he also did something that would have lasting impact. He transformed one of his estates into a safari operation. But not the old kind of safari, where wealthy hunters would come to shoot lions and elephants and take home trophies. Digby created something new. He created the concept of the photographic safari. "Come to Africa," he said. "Bring your cameras instead of your rifles. Shoot the animals with film, not bullets. Take home photographs, not heads." It sounds obvious now. Every safari company in the world operates on this principle. But in the 1950s and 1960s, it was revolutionary. Digby, who had spent his youth hunting tigers in India, had realized that killing these magnificent animals wasn't sport. It was waste. He wanted to preserve them, to show people their beauty without destroying them. He became one of the pioneers of wildlife conservation and eco-tourism in Kenya. He showed that you could make a living from wildlife without killing it, that preservation could be profitable, that tourism could be sustainable. His estates became models for what modern safari operations should be, and Digby lived out his life in Kenya, raising cattle, running safaris, watching his daughters grow up, becoming a grandfather, and slowly becoming a legend. Veterans of Arnhem would visit. Historians would interview him. People wanted to hear his stories, wanted to understand the man who had carried an umbrella into battle. In 1907, director Richard Attenborough made A Bridge Too Far, a star-studded film about Operation Market Garden based on Cornelius Ryan's book. Digby was invited to the set as a consultant. The character of Major Harry Carlyle, played by Christopher Good, was based on Digby, though the film merged him with Jack Grayburn into a composite character. In the film, Major Carlyle famously tells a captured German officer, "We're sorry we don't have the facilities to take you all prisoner. Was there anything else?" It's a great scene, very British, very dry. But it doesn't capture the real Digby. The real Digby was stranger, braver, more impossible than any film could show. In 1978, the Dutch renamed the bridge at Arnhem. It's now called the John Frost Bridge, in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Frost, who commanded the defense. But everyone who fought there knows it could just as easily have been called Digby's Bridge. Digby died in Nanyuki, Kenya, on March 21, 1993. He was 75 years old. He had lived long enough to see the end of the Cold War, the transformation of Kenya into a modern nation, and the preservation of his legacy. He was buried in Kenya, the country he had made his home. So, what do we make of Digby Tatham Warder? How do we understand a man who carried an umbrella into battle, who led bayonet charges wearing a bowler hat, who disabled an armored vehicle by poking someone in the eye with an umbrella, who escorted a chaplain through mortar fire because it might rain? It would be easy to dismiss him as an eccentric, a Mad Jack figure whose antics made for great stories but didn't really matter. But that would be completely wrong. Digby mattered enormously. His aggressive leadership got A Company to Arnhem Bridge when 2 other battalions were stopped. His unconventional tactics, the bugle calls, the use of back gardens, the willingness to improvise, those kept his men moving when others were pinned down. His visible, fearless presence during the defense, walking around with that ridiculous umbrella while mortars exploded around him, kept morale high when the situation was hopeless. Soldiers fight for many reasons. They fight for their country, for their comrades, for survival. But sometimes they fight because they see their commander, calm and unconcerned, walking through fire. And they think, if he can do it, so can I. Digby gave his men courage by example. He showed them that fear could be overcome, that absurdity could be a weapon, that audacity could win battles. And after the battle, his leadership during Operation Pegasus saved 138 men who would otherwise have spent the rest of the war in German prison camps. He didn't have to do that. He was wounded. He was exhausted. He could have hidden out and waited for liberation. But that wasn't Digby. Digby was a man who spent 5 years trying to get into combat, who finally got his chance, and who made every second count. The umbrella, the bowler hat, the bugle calls, these weren't just eccentricities, they were tactical choices. The umbrella made him visible and identifiable in the chaos of battle. The bugle calls worked when radios failed. The bowler hat and the humor, the dry wit in the face of death. That was how he kept his men sane when everything else was falling apart. British military history is full of eccentric officers. There's Mad Jack Churchill, who fought with a longbow and bagpipes. There's Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart, who pulled out his own eye and bit off his own fingers when doctors wouldn't amputate. There's Orde Wingate, who led the Chindites and conducted briefings while naked and scrubbing himself with a brush. Britain has a long tradition of valuing individual initiative, even when that initiative looks bizarre to everyone else. But Digby stands out even among that crowd. Because Digby wasn't just brave, he wasn't just eccentric, he was effective. He accomplished his mission. He got his men to the bridge. He held it longer than planned. He saved lives when the battle was over. He did everything that was asked of him and more. And he did it while making it look almost easy, while making his men believe that anything was possible. The Battle of Arnhem was a defeat. Operation Market Garden failed. The Allies didn't cross the Rhine until March 1945, 6 months later than planned. Thousands of men died or were captured. The Dutch civilians who had welcomed the liberators suffered terribly when the Germans retaliated. The northern Netherlands endured the hunger winter, a famine that killed thousands. The strategic objectives were not achieved, but the defense of Arnhem Bridge, the 4 days that Frost's battalion held out, became a symbol of British courage and determination. It became a story of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. It became, in the words of one correspondent, a reason for men to say for the rest of their lives, "I was at Arnhem." And at the center of that story, walking through mortar fire with an umbrella, leading charges in a bowler hat, disabling armored cars with the most British weapon imaginable, is Digby Tatham Warder. He waited 5 years to fight his war, and when he finally got his chance, he fought it with style, courage, and an umbrella. The next time someone tells you that one person can't make a difference, that individual actions don't matter in modern warfare, tell them about Digby. Tell them about the man who carried an umbrella to war and used it to win battles. Tell them about the officer who told a terrified chaplain not to worry about bullets because he had an umbrella. Tell them about the soldier who escaped from German captivity, organized 138 men behind enemy lines, and led them to safety. Tell them about the farmer who revolutionized safari tourism and helped preserve African wildlife. Tell them about Major Allison Digby Tatham Warder, DSO, the man who proved that courage, leadership, and a good umbrella can change the course of battles. He died in '93, but his legend lives on. There's a bridge in Arnhem with his commander's name on it. There are museums with his story in them. There are books and films and documentaries. And there are people, decades later, still telling the story of the British officer who took an umbrella to war. Because some stories are too good, too impossible, too perfect to be forgotten. Some stories remind us that even in the darkest moments, even when everything seems lost, humanity can shine through. Not just courage, not just duty, but humor, creativity, and the absolute refusal to take yourself too seriously even when death is all around. That was Digby. That's his legacy. And that's why, 80 years later, we're still talking about the man with the umbrella,